Save Queen of Sheba by Louise Moeri. Chapter 11. That night they slept heavily, though once or twice King David awoke to hear the steady rush of the rain across the mouth of the cave and the wind whistling through the broken rocks. At last, his bones aching from the hard earth, he lay awake, staring into the darkness. His one consuming need was to catch up with the wagons. Everything else was beginning to recede into a fog of lost purposes. He could now bring himself to acknowledge this, indifferent as to whether they ever made it to Oregon, to the promised land of the Willamette where, he had been told, crops would grow almost overnight, and the game was thick in the forest. The rivers full of fish. Maybe later, when they were back with Pa and Ma, and could feel the safety of the wagons and armed men all around them. Maybe then he would care again about Oregon. But for now, all he wanted was to press on, put one foot in front of the other, make tracks that stitched one horizon to the next, and eventually ate up the distance between them and the wagons. He wanted Pa and Ma, a real campfire, hot food, to be able to sleep at night, knowing they were not alone. He realized that he was far from certain as to the exact whereabouts of the remaining wagons, or how things actually stood with them, although he was sure that they carried wounded, maybe dying, men and women, and had lost horses and cattle, guns and supplies. From the signs he had seen so far, he believed that the raiders had followed the wagons for several days, harrying them and wreaking further damage, although he did not believe any more wagons had been lost. He could only guess at where they were now and what they were doing, but his best judgment was that they were at least 4 days ahead of him, a distance of 60 to 80 miles. They were probably near or already at Fort Laramie by now, and he was sure that once the train arrived at the fort, a search party would be sent back to bury the dead and to look for survivors. Wagon Master Keene and the others would not know that all except him and Queen of Sheba had perished back there at the scene of the first attack. So they would send back a rescue party, and Pa would be with them if he was alive and able to sit on a horse. The thing that pressed him most at the moment was his lack of surety about directions. He believed he had kept a fairly accurate northwest course after the rain had started, and he had lost the trail of the wagons. But it would have been easy for him to have wandered a little to the left or right, and even a small error could put him miles off the trail. As soon as the rain ended, he would have to make a big circle around the butte, where they were now camped, until he cut the wagon's trail again. Hours crept by, using the day up bit by bit as the rain continued to fall. Queen of Sheba had made a bed for her doll. She had arranged a long row of stones, placed a few wisps of grass on them, and now her doll, wrapped in its blanket, lay there. "This is Margaret Ann Beechman," she told King David, "and she's asleep in the wagon." Queen of Sheba arranged the doll's blanket again, and then went behind a boulder and crouched down out of sight. As King David watched listlessly, Queen of Sheba reappeared, creeping stealthily around the face of the rock. In her hand was a crooked stick. She slid silently forward, stick upraised. Then, with a shrill cry, she pounced on the doll, whacking and whacking it with the crooked stick. King David jerked into a horror-struck alertness. Then he lunged forward and racked the stick out of his sister's hand. "What are you doing?" he cried. "You playing? You're an Indian?" Queen of Sheba aimed furious blows at the doll. "I hate her! I hate Margaret Ann Beechman! This is how the Indians do it. I'm going to scalp her! Scalp her! Scalp her!" King David stirred the ragged slices of bacon in the little pan. He had built such a small fire that it gave out very little heat, and the bacon was barely cooking. From time to time he glared at Queen of Sheba, who was restlessly arranging and rearranging her doll, but she kept one bony shoulder turned to shut him out of her female business, and her face was granite-like, cold and absorbed. "You ought to be ashamed," he grunted. "I helped you fix up a nice doll to play with, and then you make out like you're scalping it. You ought to be ashamed. You ain't no Indian." Carelessly pushing her matted hair back, Queen of Sheba took the doll up and laid it over her shoulder. She was humming tunelessly. "Now it's a baby," she told him grudgingly. "Miss Ferrier's baby, Joseph." But Miss Ferrier's baby died. King David had watched while Pa and some others took shovels to the stony soil, and still others made a tiny coffin. And many had watched while the wagons were driven over the little grave to hide it forever from wolves and other marauders. "Yes," said Queen of Sheba. "I'm going to bury him in a minute. Dig a grave and bury him." King David, no longer heated by his anger, shivered. "Why don't you rock the baby?" he suggested strongly. "Feed it some nice hot mush and rock it to sleep." "No, this baby died," said Queen of Sheba. She took up a piece of wood and stubbornly dug a hole and pounded the doll into it. Then she dragged soil up from the floor of the cave and heaped it over to make a grave. "His name is Joseph, and he's dead." The long afternoon crept by and evening fell, with only the sounds of wind and rain to mark the passing of the hours. King David sat silent, rifle in hand, watching from the front of the cave, even though by now he could see nothing. He had watered the mare from a puddle where water collected as the rain sheeted down the rimrock, and pulled more grass for her. He had been able to refill the canteens with rainwater and then make another flat, greasy mix of cornmeal cooked with water and bacon grease. They both ate a lot, all he had prepared, and he felt comforted a little that his belly no longer hurt. Before it was completely dark, he had cleared the rocks away from a level place on the cave floor, spread the quilt on it, and Queen of Sheba for once crept into it without protest. She lay on her back now, snoring a little, with the doll, which she had dug up from its grave beside her. Tomorrow, she had told him, the doll would be an Indian, and the soldiers would come and kill him. Chapter 12. The rain stopped just before daybreak. King David, sleeping lightly, heard the pounding rush of the rain dwindle and finally cease, but he waited a little longer before crawling out from under the quilt. At the dusky back of the cave, Maggie was sleeping on her feet, her head hanging low, one big hind hoof tilted in its rim. Her harness lay nearby, spread out on a couple of boulders, and the silver balls on the hames gleamed in the dimness. A pale gray light was creeping in under the overhang by the time King David slid carefully away from Queen of Sheba, so as not to wake her, and stood in the opening behind the big boulders. It was still too dark to see much, but it seemed that the storm was over. Great pearl-colored rifts were appearing in the clouds, and the wind had gentled to become only a fitful breeze. There was a heavy scent of wet earth and sage in the air, and a meadowlark was just beginning to sing. King David's clothes were still a little damp from the rain, and he would have liked to wrap the quilt around him, but of course he could not do that. He had to leave it tucked around Queen of Sheba to keep her warm. Once again he was swept by a powerful surge of fury and frustration. The chance had left him to her, for him to take care of. It would have been so much easier if he had been left alone, with only himself to feed and shelter. Queen of Sheba was like the loose flap of skin that had been on his wound. He had had to cut it off because of the infection it caused, or it would have killed him. He hoped Queen of Sheba would not prove to be a burden too heavy for him to carry, and cause the death of both of them. Grudgingly, King David left Queen of Sheba asleep, and carefully made his way over the rim rock, where for half an hour he busied himself pulling grass for the mare. The grass was wet, but it was better than no feed at all, and the mare seemed to have hollow legs. She ate ravenously all the grass he could gather, and then would look around hungrily for more. Even so, she was gaunt. She needed grain to keep up her strength, although they were not really working her that hard. They had been taking turns riding the horse, although King David's turns had been few and far between. He rode only when his knees threatened to buckle under him, and he was afraid he would collapse and leave Queen of Sheba alone. Queen of Sheba did not really like riding the mare, and she complained endlessly because Maggie was a workhorse, broad-backed and heavy, and the harness was uncomfortable to sit on. But King David would not take the harness off the horse. He suspected that Maggie was more used to being in harness than being ridden bareback, and she was flighty enough now, without making her worse. They did indeed look peculiar, journeying along all alone across the prairie, with a horse fully harnessed right down to the blinders on her bridle, and no cart or wagon hitched to her tugs. But peculiar or not, the harness gave him more control over her, and that's what counted most. After King David fed the horse, he started a very small fire, cooked the last of the bacon, and boiled some of the cornmeal with water. As soon as possible, he put the fire out and fanned the smoke with his coat to dispense it. Although they had not sighted any Indians since the raid, there was no point in taking chances. He still had 7 bullets left in the bullet pouch, and enough caps to fire them, but he knew he couldn't load and fire the sharps fast enough, especially under attack, to do them much good. At best, he might get 1 off, maybe 2 good shots, and after that, Queen of Sheba awoke, cranky and peevish. She was very hungry, but did not want bacon or boiled cornmeal. "I want a hot biscuit," she said, "with butter on. And honey." "We ain't got none." "I want fried potatoes." "We ain't got no fried potatoes. Eat your bacon and cornmeal." "Ma doesn't make me eat no old cornmeal. I want Ma. I want Ma to fix me something to eat." King David smothered his exasperation. He was trying hard to think, and Queen of Sheba's whining aggravated him till his head started to ache. He couldn't allow anything to distract him. He had to think everything through very carefully, plan their next move. There would be no room for mistakes out here, and no second chances. On the one hand, they could stay here at the cave, a little safer probably than out on open ground, and try to hold out in case a rescue party came back looking for survivors, or maybe another wagon train came through. He had heard that several trains were making the trek this summer, and there was a slight chance that there would be one maybe a few weeks behind theirs, although there was no guarantee that he might be able to sight it from here. The main trail to Oregon was north of them, near the Platte River, but by now he did not know how far away it was. In the meantime, their food supply was dwindling, although they might make it last another 3 or 4 days at most. Game was scarce here, mostly antelope that stayed out of range of his rifle, but there was a chance he might be able to shoot some more rabbits. Equally likely with the arrival of white men, however, was the possibility that Indians might appear. He knew they were all around this territory, and he knew that even though he and Queen of Sheba were hidden in the shallow cave, it wouldn't take Indians long to find them if they should happen to pass this way. For all he knew, the cave might well be a regular stopping place for tribes moving through the area. It had plainly sheltered people many times before this. Balanced against the possibility of staying in the cave was the possibility of moving out, searching for the tracks of the wagon train, and making a last attempt to either catch up with Pa and Ma and the others, or make it alone to Fort Laramie. He had no illusions about their chances. They were both weak and half-starved. Cornmeal and water, even with a little bacon, didn't put much strength into your bones and muscles. He had lost quite a bit of blood, and the fever caused by his wound had weakened him. Queen of Sheba was not a strong child at best. That was one of the reasons why Ma had always favored her so much. He could see that Queen of Sheba had lost weight these last few days, and even the possibility of getting back to Ma, that he dangled in front of her, barely drove her on. It wasn't impossible that she just might lie down and refuse to move again, and his reduced strength would make it very hard for him to save her then. Given just the right set of conditions, the small package of bone and muscle that made up Queen of Sheba could easily turn into a burden of such intolerable weight that neither of them would live to make it out of this wilderness. But as the last of the smoke from the little fire drifted away on the breeze, and the sun came out from behind the broken clouds, it seemed that the various possibilities changed into probabilities. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that they must go on. Chance of rescue if they waited here was too slim to gamble on. No, they would have to push on. Try to make the fort or the wagons before their last supplies of food and ammunition and their remaining strength gave out. King David forced Queen of Sheba to choke down a few bites of the soggy cornmeal, and then ate all she left. He harnessed Maggie and led her out from under the overhang, and then boosted Queen of Sheba up onto her broad back. With some regret, he looked back once into the shelter of the cave, and then led Maggie down the slope, in what he hoped would be the right direction. By late morning, they were no more than 5 or 6 miles from the cave. King David had realized that he must make every effort to locate the tracks of the wagon train, because they could not afford to waste time going the wrong way. As the sky cleared, he quickly got his directions from the sun, and he knew that the wagons had to be moving toward the northwest. Accordingly, as they set out, he had set for his course a half circle, hoping to cut across the track and follow it in. The farther west they traveled, the more broken the country became, slowly rising, he supposed, into the higher country that flanked the massive ranges of the Rocky Mountains ahead. With the rain over, the wet ground would dry fast, and he was fairly sure that the tracks of the wagons would still be visible enough to follow. Queen of Sheba bobbed along on the horse without saying much. Her face was drawn, and her silence made him nervous. "Look, Queen of Sheba," he tried to arouse her. "Way over there. Some antelope. Sure wish I could shoot one. Then we'd eat good. I'm hungry, the child said listlessly. I know. When we catch up with the wagons, you'll have something good to eat. Biscuits and honey. Maybe. Or beans. My legs hurt. He paused to look where she pointed and was dismayed at the sight. Both of her bony legs were bruised and raw, where the horse's harness rubbed the skin as she rode. No wonder she complained so much about riding the mare. Maybe if he let her walk a while, she would hush up about that one misery at least. All right, he said, lifting her down. I'll let you walk a while. Why don't you eat an apple? We still got some left. Queen of Sheba accepted an apple and settled into a shuffling walk. King David had tied the strings of her sunbonnet under her chin to protect her face from the sun and keep the heat from tiring her as long as possible. Her shoes, he noted, were beginning to show a heavy wear from the stony ground and abrasive sand. The toes were scuffed, and a button was missing from the left one. Margaret Ann Beechman's pa might have more money than Pa, but he didn't have very good shoes for his daughter. King David took one of the remaining apples and climbed onto the horse. Maggie snorted and raised a foot to kick, but as soon as he was astride, she settled into her usual plodding walk. As they pushed ahead, the land was becoming rougher, with low rocky ridges and shallow swales, and a dry stream bed that made it hard to see very far in any direction. Once he got off and left the mare, with Queen of Sheba holding the rope, standing just under the crest of a hill, so he could go forward and reconnoiter without exposing them to view. Luke Skinner's hat was so big on him that he had to tilt his head far back to see out from under the brim. Queen of Sheba stared at him. "Why don't you take that hat off?" she muttered. "You look silly." "Can't do that," he told her. "A hawk just flew by, and if she looked down and saw this hole in my head, she might think it looked like a hole in a hollow tree and decide to build a nest in it. And what would I do with baby birds hatching out inside my head?" Queen of Sheba only stared silently at him. "Well, come on," he said flatly. "Let's get moving. I'll ride the horse. You can walk if you'd rather, but keep close behind me now." It was past the middle of the afternoon when King David's eyes, blurring again with fatigue, picked out a faint mark across the next grassy hill. Eagerly he pressed forward, pushing the mare along. Yes, there was another mark further on. Wagon tracks, no doubt about it. Wagon tracks. He jerked the mare to a halt and slid off to peer closely at the crushed grass. "It's their tracks!" He crawled excitedly over his shoulder to Queen of Sheba. "We done it! Now all we got to do is follow their tracks." Filled once more with hope and energy, he climbed back onto the mare and kicked her sides to get her moving as fast as possible. "Come on, walk as fast as you can. Now let's see how far we can get before dark." His head was pounding again, but King David pushed forward. Sighting the wagon tracks had flooded him with optimism. He could believe once more that they would make it now. Yes, they would make it now. He did not know how much time had gone by since they struck the trail of the wagons. But suddenly the leveling rays of the sun made King David look up from the wagon tracks. The tired mare thudded to a stop, lowered her head, snorted up a puff of dust from the ground, and grabbed a mouthful of the scanty grass that grew among the red and yellow flowering prickly pears. They had just crossed a low rise and were dropping down into a swale where clumps of tall sage were clustered. "Guess we'll take cover in that high brush over there," said King David as he slid off the mare. "Be dark soon. Got to eat a little, get some sleep." You tired, Queen of Sheba?" He looked around, expecting a peevish reply from the child. But behind the horse lay only an empty reach of grass and stunted sage, spotted here and there with buffalo wallows. All he could see were the horse's tracks. Nothing more. Queen of Sheba was gone.